I can't move. What's happening? Am I trapped?
When the brain stops sending signals to the body is still. Breathing is steady. The eyes are open, tracking, aware. Inside the brain, intention forms clearly, precisely, without delay. The command is sent, nothing moves. A hand is supposed to rise. The instruction leaves the motor cortex exactly as it always has. There is no tremor, no hesitation in the signal itself. But the arm remains fixed in place, unchanged, unresponsive to the order it just received. Sensation is intact. The body can feel pressure, temperature, position. The brain registers everything correctly, confirming that the system is awake and receiving input. Only one direction is failing: the output. In locked-in syndrome, in brainstem stroke, and in advanced amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the same pattern appears. Consciousness remains functional, but the pathway that carries commands outward begins to break. The brain continues to generate movement, but the body is no longer connected to it. The motor command begins in the primary motor cortex, where neurons encode direction, force, and sequence. This signal is electrical, organized, and specific, traveling through upper motor neurons designed to deliver it downward without distortion. At this stage, nothing is wrong. The signal descends through the internal capsule and into the corticospinal tract, a tightly bundled pathway responsible for voluntary movement. Speed is maintained. Timing is preserved. The instruction remains intact as it approaches the brainstem, the central relay between brain and body. At the level of the brainstem, the pathway narrows and reorganizes. Fibers cross, redirect, and align with nuclei that will distribute commands to the rest of the body. This region is dense, compact, and critical. A disruption here does not weaken the signal. It stops it. A vascular event, such as a brainstem stroke, can block blood flow within seconds. Neurons in this region lose oxygen, then electrical stability, then function. The signal arrives, but the relay is no longer capable of passing it forward. There is no partial movement, no delay. The interruption is absolute. Below this point, lower motor neurons remain structurally intact. Muscles are still capable of contracting. The neuromuscular junction is functional. But without input from above, these systems remain inactive, waiting for a signal that no longer reaches them. The brain continues to send commands. It repeats them, refines them, increases effort. Each attempt is identical in structure, identical in intent. None of them produce movement. This is not a failure of strength. It is not a failure of muscle. It is a failure of transmission. In early stages of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, degeneration begins along the same descending pathways. Unlike stroke, the progression is gradual. Signals begin to degrade, then weaken, then disappear entirely as motor neurons deteriorate. Speed distinguishes these conditions. A brainstem stroke produces immediate disconnection. ALS produces progressive loss. But the endpoint converges. A brain that continues to command and a body that no longer receives. Reflexes may still occur. Some pathways bypass the damaged region, allowing automatic responses to persist. But voluntary movement, which depends on precise cortical signaling, remains absent. The system is no longer coordinated. It is divided. At the level of milliseconds, the failure is already complete. The signal has reached its boundary and cannot cross it. The body remains still, not because it cannot move, but because it is no longer being reached. The brain does not recognize this immediately. It continues to operate under the assumption that output is possible. Commands continue to form unchanged, repeating into silence. There is no feedback confirming failure, only absence. And the separation begins. The signal continues to form with full precision. Each command originates in the motor cortex with the same structure, the same intensity, and the same expectation of execution. Nothing in the brain suggests that the pathway has been interrupted. There is no error message, no internal alert that the command failed. Without feedback, the system assumes success. The brain issues another command, then another, increasing effort, increasing frequency. The output pathway remains silent, but the input loop does not register the absence. At the spinal cord level, lower motor neurons remain electrically stable. Their membranes are capable of depolarization, their axons intact, their connections to muscle fibers unchanged. But without descending input, their threshold is never reached. Muscle fibers remain in a ready state. Calcium channels are closed. Actin and myosin do not engage. There is no contraction, no visible attempt to move. The disconnect is complete at the level of activation. In brainstem stroke, the interruption is localized but absolute. The corticospinal tract is severed functionally, not structurally removed, but rendered inactive by loss of viable neurons. Signals arrive at the damaged region and dissipate. In contrast, Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis progresses along the same pathway. Upper motor neurons begin to degenerate, reducing signal strength over time. Eventually, lower motor neurons also deteriorate, removing the final link to muscle activation. Speed differs. Outcome aligns. At the synaptic level, transmission depends on intact presynaptic release and postsynaptic reception. In these conditions, the presynaptic signal either fails to arrive or arrives too weak to trigger neurotransmitter release. The synapse remains structurally present, but functionally silent. Electrical intent does not translate into chemical signaling. Some pathways attempt compensation. Adjacent neurons may increase firing rates. Alternative circuits may engage briefly. These adjustments create transient, inconsistent outputs, but they do not restore controlled movement. The system cannot reroute around a collapsed relay of this density. Respiratory control begins to enter the system. The brainstem houses centers responsible for automatic breathing. If the lesion extends or progresses, these centers are affected, reducing or eliminating spontaneous respiration. Mechanical support becomes necessary when this transition occurs. Eye movement becomes a critical exception. In many cases of locked-in syndrome, vertical eye movements and blinking are preserved because their control pathways bypass the damaged region. This becomes the only remaining voluntary output. A single functional channel remains while all others are silent. Communication compresses into minimal signals. A blink becomes a word. A gaze shift becomes a response. The brain adapts to this limited output, attempting to encode complex intent into the only available pathway. The rest of the body remains inactive. Reflex arcs continue to operate independently. A stimulus applied to the skin may trigger a withdrawal reflex without cortical involvement. These movements are automatic, not controlled, and do not reflect voluntary intent. The distinction between reflex and command becomes absolute. Time begins to reinforce the disconnection. Minutes pass without restored transmission. Hours confirm stability of the failure. Secondary processes begin to activate within neurons deprived of input or output. Disuse alters function. Muscle tissue, though initially intact, begins to lose efficiency without activation. Neural pathways, without repeated use, undergo further degradation. The system shifts from acute interruption to sustained separation. There is no gradual return, only persistence. The brain continues to generate commands with unchanged clarity. Planning remains intact. Awareness remains intact. The internal model of movement remains accurate, but execution remains absent. The system is now operating in two independent states. The brain continues to function as if connected. The body remains in enforced silence. The gap does not close. It stabilizes. The absence of movement begins to change the system itself. What started as a transmission failure becomes a sustained state, and the body adapts to inactivity at every level. Signals continue to descend from the cortex, but repetition without effect produces no reinforcement. Synaptic pathways that depend on use begin to weaken. The command is still formed, but its downstream influence diminishes further with time. In the spinal cord, lower motor neurons remain viable, but their firing patterns become irregular in the absence of coordinated input. Without structured activation, baseline excitability shifts and spontaneous discharges may appear without producing meaningful movement. The output system loses synchronization. Muscle tissue begins to respond to inactivity. Without repeated contraction, protein turnover shifts, leading to gradual atrophy. The fibers reduce in size, not because they are damaged directly, but because they are no longer being used. Strength declines without ever being tested. Circulatory dynamics begin to change. Immobility reduces venous return, increasing the risk of clot formation. Blood flow becomes dependent on passive mechanisms rather than active muscle contraction, altering distribution and pressure. The system slows under static conditions. At the brainstem level, the initial failure remains unchanged. Neurons that lost function do not recover if the damage is ischemic or degenerative. The relay point stays inactive, maintaining the separation between intention and execution. The boundary becomes permanent. Sensory pathways continue to deliver information upward. The brain receives continuous updates about body position, contact, and environment. This creates a persistent mismatch between perceived state and intended action. Awareness continues without response. Autonomic functions operate independently. Heart rate, digestion, and temperature regulation proceed without voluntary control. These systems remain connected through separate pathways that do not rely on the damaged efferent roots. Life continues without movement. Respiratory involvement introduces a critical threshold. If brainstem centers responsible for automatic breathing are affected, ventilation becomes insufficient. External support replaces internal control, shifting breathing from autonomous to mechanical. Airflow becomes dependent on intervention. In progressive conditions like amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, degeneration spreads. Upper motor neuron loss is followed by lower motor neuron involvement, removing both command and execution layers. Muscles lose not only instruction, but also their direct neural connection. The system collapses from both ends. Compare progression patterns. In acute brainstem stroke, the disconnection is immediate and complete, stabilizing quickly. In ALS, the decline is sequential, extending the period of partial function before total loss. Duration differs. Direction converges. Communication pathways narrow further. If eye movement remains intact, it becomes the primary interface. If degeneration reaches those nuclei, even this channel is lost, removing the final voluntary output. Silence extends across all systems. At the cellular level, prolonged inactivity alters gene expression in muscle fibers, favoring energy conservation over force production. Neural circuits reduce plasticity when not engaged, limiting the possibility of functional reorganization. Adaptation reinforces limitation. Time no longer represents recovery. It represents consolidation of the disconnection. Each hour without signal transmission strengthens the separation between brain and body. Reversal becomes less likely with each interval. The brain continues to generate motor plans with full fidelity. Sequences remain accurate. Coordination remains intact internally. But there is no external confirmation, no movement to validate the command. Execution remains theoretical. The system now exists in a stable divided state. One side generates intent continuously. The other side remains structurally present, but functionally unreachable. The disconnection is no longer an event. It is the new operating condition. The persistence of disconnection begins to affect systems that depend on coordinated movement. Swallowing requires precise sequencing between cranial nerves and brainstem nuclei. When these pathways are disrupted, coordination fails, and material may enter the airway instead of the esophagus. Aspiration becomes a direct consequence of signal loss. Salivary control declines as voluntary and reflex components lose synchronization. Secretions accumulate because clearance mechanisms depend on coordinated muscle activity. The airway is exposed to substances it is not designed to handle. Protection mechanisms remain incomplete. In brainstem stroke, cranial nerve nuclei responsible for facial movement, swallowing, and speech may be directly affected. Signals intended for these nuclei never produce output, or the nuclei themselves are non-functional. The result is loss of expression, speech, and safe swallowing. Multiple outputs fail at a single relay point. Compare localized versus spreading failure. A confined lesion may preserve certain cranial nerve functions, allowing limited facial or ocular movement. A broader lesion removes these channels entirely, expanding the disconnection across more systems. Extent determines residual function. Respiratory coordination continues to degrade if adjacent centers are involved. The rhythm generated by the medulla becomes unstable. Breathing may become irregular, shallow, or absent, requiring mechanical ventilation to maintain oxygenation. Autonomy transitions to dependency. In progressive degeneration, such as Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis, bulbar involvement introduces similar deficits over time. Speech becomes slurred, swallowing inefficient, and airway protection compromised as motor neurons deteriorate. Gradual decline mirrors acute loss. Nutritional intake becomes dependent on assisted methods. Oral feeding is no longer reliable when swallowing coordination fails. Alternative routes are introduced to maintain caloric intake without risking airway compromise. Input must bypass the disrupted system. Postural control is absent. Without motor output, the body cannot adjust position to relieve pressure or maintain alignment. Continuous immobility places sustained force on specific areas, altering tissue integrity. Pressure replaces movement as the dominant mechanical factor. Circulatory adjustments rely on positional changes and muscle activity. Without these, blood distribution becomes less efficient. Dependent regions experience increased pressure, while others receive reduced flow. Distribution becomes uneven. Infection risk increases as multiple protective systems weaken. Reduced cough reflex, impaired swallowing, and immobility combine to create conditions favorable for respiratory and systemic infections. Barrier functions remain, but clearance is reduced. The brain remains fully capable of processing these changes. Sensory input continues to informative discomfort, pressure, and internal states. However, there is no capacity to respond through movement or repositioning. Awareness persists without corrective action. Communication remains constrained to whatever output pathways are preserved. In locked-in syndrome, vertical eye movement and blinking may still function, allowing structured communication. If these pathways are compromised, interaction is lost entirely. Output channels determine connection to the environment. Compare reversibility. Edema or inflammation affecting the brainstem may resolve, restoring partial function if neurons remain viable. Ischemic necrosis or neurodegeneration does not reverse, fixing the system in its disconnected state. Outcome depends on underlying mechanism. Time extends the consequences. Days of immobility lead to measurable tissue changes. Weeks reinforce structural adaptations that favor inactivity. The system stabilizes further into its separated configuration. Recovery becomes less probable as duration increases. The brain continues to generate coordinated plans for movement, speech, and interaction. These plans remain accurate and complete. They do not translate into action because the pathway remains interrupted. Intent accumulates without release. The body maintains vital functions through autonomous systems and external support. Movement, expression, and voluntary control remain absent. The division between brain and body is maintained across all affected pathways. The system operates without reintegration. The longer the disconnection persists, the more secondary systems reorganize around the absence of voluntary control. What was initially a neural transmission failure becomes a full-body state defined by immobility and dependency on non-volitional processes. Circulatory patterns adapt to stillness. Without periodic muscle contraction to assist venous return, blood begins to pool in dependent regions. Pressure within vessels changes distribution patterns, increasing strain on localized areas while reducing effective circulation elsewhere. Clot formation becomes a measurable risk under these conditions. Skin integrity begins to reflect sustained pressure. Tissue compressed between bone and surface receives reduced blood flow, limiting oxygen delivery. Over time, this leads to localized breakdown, not from external trauma, but from uninterrupted internal pressure. Structural damage emerges from lack of movement. Temperature regulation becomes less efficient. Peripheral circulation no longer adjusts dynamically through activity, and the body relies more heavily on autonomic responses. Heat distribution becomes uneven, and response to environmental changes slows. Regulation persists, but with reduced precision. The digestive system continues to function through autonomic control, but coordination with voluntary components is absent. Swallowing, initiation of intake, and positioning are no longer under conscious control, requiring external management to maintain consistency. Input becomes externally regulated. In progressive conditions such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, denervation of muscle progresses beyond disuse. Lower motor neuron loss removes the direct neural connection to muscle fibers, leading to more rapid and irreversible atrophy. Muscle loss shifts from inactivity-driven to denervation-driven. Compare structural preservation. In locked-in syndrome due to brainstem stroke, muscles remain innervated but unused. In owls, both command and connection degrade, accelerating tissue loss and functional decline. Different mechanisms produce similar immobility through distinct pathways. Respiratory dependence stabilizes into a controlled system. Mechanical ventilation replaces spontaneous breathing when central control is insufficient. Oxygenation and carbon dioxide removal are maintained externally, decoupling respiration from neural initiation. Breathing continues without internal command. Communication systems reach their limits. If eye movement remains, it becomes structured into consistent patterns for interaction. If this pathway is lost, the brain remains active without any channel to transmit information outward. Output capacity defines interaction, not cognition. At the neural level, persistent lack of successful output reduces adaptive plasticity. Circuits involved in voluntary movement remain active in planning, but receive no reinforcement from execution. Over time, their influence on downstream systems becomes functionally irrelevant. Activity without effect leads to isolation within the system. Sensory input continues uninterrupted. The brain processes discomfort, pressure, and environmental changes continuously. However, the inability to respond converts these signals into unmodifiable states rather than triggers for action. Perception no longer leads to correction. Time expands the consequences beyond immediate physiology. Days introduce risk. Weeks establish patterns. Months reinforce structural and functional changes that align with sustained immobility. The system transitions from disrupted to stabilized in a disconnected configuration. Compare temporal dynamics. Acute injury produces immediate separation with rapid stabilization. Progressive degeneration extends the transition, but ultimately reaches the same endpoint of complete disconnection between intent and execution. Path differs. Endpoint converges. Support systems compensate for lost functions. Nutrition, respiration, positioning, and communication are maintained through external means where possible. These interventions preserve biological viability without restoring voluntary control. Survival becomes supported rather than self-directed. The brain continues to operate with full internal coherence. It plans, evaluates, and processes information accurately. The absence of output does not alter its capacity to generate commands. Execution remains absent despite intact planning. The body exists as a maintained structure with limited autonomous function and no voluntary movement. The brain exists as an active control center without access to its effectors. The separation is now complete across all major systems. The system now operates under a persistent mismatch between intention and outcome. Motor plans are generated continuously, but without execution, there is no confirmation loop to refine or terminate them. Commands persist longer than intended because the expected endpoint never occurs. Termination of action depends on feedback that is no longer present. In intact systems, movement produces sensory feedback that informs the brain of completion. This feedback allows precise adjustment of force and timing. In disconnection, the feedback loop is broken. The brain issues commands but receives no confirmation, creating a continuous open-loop state. Control becomes theoretical rather than functional. At the level of cortical circuits, repeated activation without outcome alters firing patterns. Neurons continue to engage in coordinated activity, but without downstream effect, the network begins to lose synchronization with peripheral systems. The brain remains active, but isolated from its targets. Spinal networks continue to generate baseline activity. Central pattern generators, which can produce rhythmic outputs such as stepping, remain structurally present but inactive without descending activation. These circuits are intact but inaccessible. Function exists without initiation. In conditions like locked-in syndrome, the disconnection is sharply defined. Cortical and subcortical structures remain intact, but the ventral brainstem lesion prevents signals from reaching spinal and cranial motor nuclei. The boundary is clear and fixed. The interruption is localized but system-wide in effect. In amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, degeneration spreads through both upper and lower motor neurons. This removes not only the pathway, but also the endpoints. Even if a signal could reach the spinal cord, there may be no viable neuron to transmit it further. The system loses both transmission and reception layers. Compare signal behavior. In acute brainstem injury, signals are intact up to the lesion and then terminate abruptly. In LLs, signals degrade progressively along the pathway, becoming weaker before disappearing entirely. Signal loss can be abrupt or progressive, but both eliminate output. Autonomic systems continue to function with relative independence. Cardiovascular regulation, endocrine signaling, and basic metabolic processes remain active because they rely on separate neural circuits. These systems maintain internal stability despite the loss of voluntary control. Life-sustaining functions persist without conscious input. However, interaction with the environment depends entirely on voluntary output. Without it, the system cannot modify external conditions, reposition itself, or communicate needs except through any remaining limited pathways. The system becomes internally active but externally silent. Eye movement pathways, when preserved, remain the primary interface. These pathways are controlled by nuclei that may bypass the damaged ventral brainstem. As long as they remain intact, they provide a minimal but functional output channel. A single pathway sustains interaction. If degeneration or damage extends to these nuclei, even this channel is lost. The brain continues to function, but there is no mechanism left to transmit information outward. Complete isolation occurs without loss of consciousness. Time further entrenches the separation. Neural circuits adapt to persistent inactivity by reducing responsiveness to absent signals. Muscle tissue continues to atrophy, and structural systems align with the lack of movement. Adaptation reinforces disconnection. Compare reversibility again. Temporary factors, such as inflammation, may allow partial restoration if resolved early. Structural destruction of neurons or axons does not recover, fixing the system in a permanent state. Outcome is determined by whether the pathway is suppressed or destroyed. External systems maintain physiological stability. Ventilation supports breathing. Nutritional delivery bypasses impaired swallowing. Positioning systems attempt to reduce pressure effects. These measures sustain the body without re-establishing neural control. Support replaces function, not the pathway itself. The brain continues to generate complex sequences of movement, speech, and interaction. These sequences are complete and accurate within the neural domain. They do not translate into physical action. Execution remains disconnected from intent. The system now exists as two parallel processes. One generates continuous commands. The other maintains biological viability without responding to those commands. The separation is sustained, reinforced, and stable. The system has now reached a state where internal processing continues without any measurable external effect. Neural activity within the motor cortex remains organized, producing sequences that would normally result in coordinated movement. These sequences terminate at the same fixed boundary, never reaching the structures designed to execute them. The output pathway remains non-functional despite continuous input. Without successful execution, higher-level coordination begins to lose relevance. Planning circuits still generate complex motor sequences, but there is no adaptive refinement because outcomes cannot be evaluated. The brain continues to simulate movement internally without external confirmation. Adjustment mechanisms remain active but ineffective. At the network level, synchronization between cortical regions persists. Premotor and supplementary motor areas continue to communicate with the primary motor cortex, organizing sequences and timing. However, these coordinated patterns do not propagate beyond the interruption point. Integration remains internal to the brain. Spinal circuits, deprived of descending control, shift toward baseline autonomous activity. Reflex arcs may remain intact, but their responses are no longer modulated by cortical input. This creates a separation between voluntary intent and automatic response. Control and reaction no longer interact. In acute brainstem injury, this separation stabilizes quickly. The lesion defines a permanent boundary that signals cannot cross. Above the lesion, activity remains organized. Below it, systems operate independently of cortical influence. The system divides into two non-communicating layers. In progressive degeneration, such as Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis, the boundary is not fixed initially. It expands over time as more neurons become non-functional. Areas that previously transmitted signals begin to fail, extending the zone of disconnection. The separation grows until it encompasses the entire pathway. Compare structural states. In locked-in syndrome, lower motor neurons and muscles remain structurally intact but inactive. In ALS, these structures deteriorate, removing both the pathway and the endpoint of transmission. Different structural conditions produce the same absence of movement. Sensory processing continues to inform the brain of the body's condition. Inputs regarding pressure, discomfort, and environmental changes are processed normally. These signals do not lead to corrective movement, creating a persistent mismatch between perception and response. Awareness continues without the ability to act. Autonomic regulation maintains internal stability. Heart rate, vascular tone, and metabolic processes adapt to maintain equilibrium. These systems operate independently of voluntary motor pathways and remain functional despite the disconnection. Internal balance persists without voluntary control. Communication remains dependent on any preserved output channel. When eye movements are intact, they become structured into consistent patterns that allow interaction. This requires stable control of a minimal pathway, while all others remain inactive. A narrow channel carries all intentional output. If this channel is lost, the system reaches complete external silence. The brain continues to process, plan, and respond internally, but no signal reaches the external environment. Isolation becomes total at the level of output. Time reinforces the separation further. Neural pathways involved in voluntary movement receive continuous activation without effect, while peripheral systems remain inactive. This imbalance reduces the influence of cortical output on the overall system. The brain's commands no longer shape the body's state. External support systems continue to maintain physiological function. Ventilation, nutrition, and positioning are managed independently of neural control. These systems preserve life while leaving the underlying disconnection unchanged. Maintenance replaces integration. The system is now defined by two parallel operations. One produces structured neural activity representing intent. The other sustains biological processes without responding to that intent. The connection between them is no longer present. The system has moved beyond simple separation and now functions as a sustained mismatch between internal command and external state. Neural activity continues to generate coordinated motor sequences, but without execution, these sequences accumulate without resolution. Commands persist without termination. In intact systems, each movement produces feedback that confirms completion and resets the circuit. Here, that reset signal never arrives. Motor planning areas continue to activate, expecting closure that does not occur, extending the duration and repetition of internal commands. Closure is absent at the circuit level. Cortical output remains structurally intact, but its influence diminishes because it produces no measurable effect. Over time, this reduces the functional significance of voluntary motor pathways within the overall system. Output loses relevance without impact. Spinal motor neurons remain capable of activation, but their thresholds are not reached without descending input. Baseline excitability may fluctuate, but without coordinated signals, no organized contraction occurs. Activation potential remains unused. In progressive degeneration, lower motor neurons begin to fail alongside upper motor neurons, removing the final relay required for muscle contraction. Even if partial signals are generated, they no longer reach muscle fibers in a meaningful way, effectively eliminating execution at the endpoint. This contrasts with acute disconnection, where a clear and immediate boundary forms, stabilizing the system quickly. Progressive degeneration instead creates a shifting boundary that gradually settles only once the entire pathway is compromised. Despite different trajectories, both processes converge on the same fixed outcome of total disconnection. Respiratory systems may continue through external support, as mechanical ventilation replaces brainstem-driven rhythm, allowing oxygenation without restoring neural control. In parallel, nutrition is maintained through assisted routes, preserving digestion while bypassing voluntary initiation. The body continues to function through substitution, but not through reintegration. Function persists, but control is absent. Postural systems remain inactive without voluntary adjustment, forcing reliance on external repositioning to prevent damage from sustained pressure. Tissue stress accumulates in fixed areas, requiring continuous intervention to redistribute load and preserve integrity. Sensory input, however, continues uninterrupted, feeding the brain constant information about internal state and environment. These signals fail to trigger corrective responses, creating a condition where perception no longer influences outcome. Communication becomes limited to any remaining pathways, often reduced to eye movement that must carry the full burden of expression. Complex thoughts are compressed into minimal motor output, demanding cognitive adaptation. If even this pathway fails, all external expression disappears entirely. Internal neural activity continues, but without any mechanism to transmit it outward. The system stabilizes in a state where perception, intention, and response are fully separated. Over time, these conditions consolidate as neural circuits adapt to repeated activation without effect, while peripheral systems adjust to sustained inactivity. External support maintains physiological stability, but does not restore integration between brain and body. Temporary suppression may allow recovery if resolved early, but structural loss of neurons creates permanent disconnection. The brain continues generating complete and coherent plans for movement and interaction, yet none translate into action. Execution remains entirely absent, despite intact cognitive intent. The body persists as a maintained biological structure, while the brain functions as an isolated control center without access to its effectors. At this stage, separation is no longer a disruption, but the defining feature of the system. Survival is sustained through external control and autonomous processes rather than voluntary coordination. The system operates without any functional link between intention and movement. Without movement, mechanical forces within the body become unbalanced, leading to joint fixation, connective tissue shortening, and reduced range of motion. These changes arise not from active joint disease, but from prolonged immobility. Muscle tissue continues to lose mass and efficiency, whether through disuse or complete loss of innervation, both leading to diminished functional capacity. Circulatory efficiency declines without muscular assistance, requiring intervention to maintain proper flow and prevent complications. Respiratory function, when fully supported, operates independently of neural command, with machines replacing biological rhythm. Long-term outcomes differ depending on the condition. Stable locked-in states maintain a fixed boundary, while progressive diseases eliminate both pathways and endpoints. Communication defines the final level of interaction, remaining possible only if minimal pathways survive. Sensory processing continues, but without influence over physical response. Time reinforces dependence and structural adaptation, locking the system into a stable but disconnected state. At the system level, voluntary control is no longer functional, replaced entirely by maintenance through autonomous processes and external support. The brain continues forming accurate motor plans and internal models, but these remain theoretical without execution. No alternative neural pathways emerge to compensate, as the precision of original motor circuits cannot be replicated. The system becomes defined by continuous internal activity paired with complete external silence. One side produces structured intent, while the other remains unresponsive. Over time, the system ceases attempting reconnection, stabilizing into a permanent division between neural activity and physical response. Motor planning continues as if output were possible, but completion never occurs. Function is reduced to maintenance, with movement and interaction absent unless minimal pathways persist. Different mechanisms ultimately reach the same endpoint of total disconnection. As time progresses, no new changes emerge, only reinforcement of the established state. Sensory systems continue delivering information, maintaining awareness without control over outcome. Communication, if present, is reduced to minimal signals. If absent, all activity remains internal. No compensatory circuits develop, as the specificity of motor pathways prevents substitution. The body persists through assisted circulation, respiration, and metabolism, maintaining viability without restoring voluntary control. The brain remains fully capable of generating intention, yet all outputs are confined within neural networks. The separation extends across the entire system, with every voluntary pathway blocked, degraded, or removed. No signal reaches the structures required for movement. The system is fully divided, defined by the persistence of command without execution. The command is still sent, but nothing moves.
Pathology of Fear is a medical documentary series presenting clinically documented neurologic and pathological mechanisms for educational analysis.